Welcome to Formed, where each week we navigate a relevant topic or question through honest conversations. We are three pastors with three different backgrounds on staff together at Irving Bible Church in Irving, Texas. We believe we are constantly being formed in the way of Jesus for the sake of the world, and we hope this podcast helps with that. So let's jump into this week's episode of Formed. Welcome back to another week of Formed. And we're on a roll now.
On a
3
roll.
weeks in a row. That
tell you what.
something.
I know.
I'm still coughing from being sick 3 weeks ago, though. It's making me crazy.
Okay, you got to take care of that.
Yeah, it's not as bad, but it's still just like
It's still there.
a little bit.
I will say, someone came up to me and said that they like candy corn also.
I think you said this last week. The same person.
They,
You have one person that said this. to you,
I said
and you keep talking
somebody.
about it. Yeah.
One
they also
person.
said they liked Peeps.
Yeah.
So I was like, you're kind of canceled.
You're
But
Half
if
right.
you like Peeps. But today, we're going to be talking about, this was a submitted topic by someone
Nice.
over the summer when we had our Google form open. They're like, hey, can you talk about Christianese sayings, like popular phrases, sayings, things in the evangelical culture that we say that could be
The church's popular vernacular.
Yeah, it could be right, it could be wrong,
Yeah.
could be just misunderstood. So I'm going to just throw out a phrase or throw out something, and then just we can popcorn around
Kinda riff
talking
on
about it.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, okay, let's start with number one.
Number one.
We reference this come to Jesus moment. Where does your mind go to when you hear this come to Jesus moment?
Yeah. Can't say I haven't said it. I think I have said it. So I think it refers to kind of the idea of there's this critical moment in your life, this turning point kind of moment. And I think when Christian context, in the Christian faith context, it's that moment of the most important moment of your life, the most important decision of putting your faith in Jesus, recognizing your need for a savior, and putting your trust in Jesus. I think where the sort of confusion happens is it's a bit reductionistic, because what it's doing is taking this sacred moment and equating it to the ordinary. And so that's just kind of where my mind goes to when I think about that. And like I said, I have used that term of,
Yeah, we applied in that, like, we're going to have the
This
conversation
critical-
right now,
yes,
right? We're going there.
we can't avoid
And,
this reality.
Yeah. I mean, I take it to be sort of a playful.
Yes,
Yeah, I think your
absolutely.
point of like, you're taking something sacred and, making it very sort of ordinary. But one of the things that I think about with this, I mean, forgive me, I have to Dr. Jones a little bit, but like even some of the like kind of historical background for that idea of this is a come to Jesus moment connects back to American history and the Second Great Awakening. What you had is very influential on evangelicalism as we knew it, especially the kind of tradition, the Baptist tradition that I grew up in, where at the end of every sermon, there was this moment of invitation. And it's like, now is the time of salvation. This is the moment. And, walk down the aisle and pray the prayer. Well, all of that really gets invented just a couple hundred years ago in the Second Great Awakening, where the emphasis shifted in large part from the First Great Awakening, which was very much this emphasis on Christ and Him crucified. And you saw the Spirit move in this powerful wave of revival in the United States, to the Second Great Awakening that really emphasized methodology and emphasized, some would I think even say, manipulation. So you had these revivalist preachers, and one of the most well-known among them is a guy named Charles Gradson Finney. And you can Google Charles Finney picture of this guy's a scary looking dude, but he preached all over the U.S.
Yeah.
And one of his things methodologically was this moment of calling people to repent, to turn from their sins, that kind of turn or burn kind of mentality. And so they even had one of the strategies was what they called the anxious bench, which somebody who wasn't a Christian, they were supposed to sit in a particular area because he was going to point at them and he was going to call them out. And this is where you get the advent of the kind of invitation songs, that
sounds inviting.
Yeah. But those hymns that I grew up singing that were very much in that, there was a section of our hymnal that when you got to the point of the invitation and the opportunity to walk down the aisle and pray the prayer or, raise the hand, like those were the songs that we sang. And they all got developed in this particular historical period to really create this moment where people were, in many respects, kind of emotionally manipulated into, out of response of oftentimes a fear, a sense of anxiety, dread, this moment of repentance. And so that historical movement shaped the way that we've done church in many respects. So I grew up, like I said, in that where at the end of every sermon, no matter what it was about, there was kind of this moment, this call to respond. And of course, I don't mean to suggest that God hasn't used that powerfully. I walked down an aisle and prayed a prayer. I mean, I have my story of, that come to Jesus moment for me. But it's interesting to think about kind of where that comes from historically. That hasn't been the practice of the church throughout its history. Yeah. It's really just been around the last couple of 100 years. And I, as a pastor, always want to make that invitation to trust in Christ clear, but also always want to be very careful not to create some sense of anxiety or fear that winds up emotionally manipulating people to make a response. Yeah. So I don't know, when I saw the come to Jesus moment, I thought about that history and how that shapes that way in which this come to Jesus moment is oftentimes a moment that's like, it's kind of filled with some tension, some anxiety, some fear, some like, we're going to go there. Yep. And I think about a revivalist preacher like Charles G. Finney.
Yeah, that's good.
The fact that you have Charles G. Finney just like ingrained in you. This is actually why we have candles in our service, turn and burn.
There you go. No.
I'm just kidding. That's not why we have candles at the front of the. Okay, so Romans 8:28. This gets thrown out. Something bad happens in someone's life. You hear some iteration of this, like God's working it out for the good of all things. And so, I mean, we really could do this for.
This could be the whole episode.
Yes, right. And we could use like
verses
so many different
out of context
verses out of context, but just that concept, this verse, how often it's used, and
yeah, I think often it's used as this empty platitude, used to comfort people in pain in the midst of grief. And if we really understood it, it's not an empty platitude. It's actually an overflowing promise that can really transform our lives. And so what Paul is trying to get across to us there is the idea that God is at work in our lives. Oftentimes, we can't see it. We don't understand it. It's more than we can understand or fathom or even see at times, and yet that is still true. And he's weaving together all of the circumstances of our lives for our ultimate good. And that God uses all of the circumstances, not just the good circumstances, but he can use our sin and our brokenness and our failures and our flaws. And if you think about it, like in my life, where God has done the most transformational work are in the midst of my failures, in the midst of my deepest sins, where I've had to recognize my own brokenness and my need for God. And it's brought me to a place of humility and a sense of how much I need God. And so I think God does work all things for our good. Now, while that's true, Paul is not saying that all things are good, because we know that's not the case. All things are not good. Death is not good. Cancer is not good. We can go on. And so that's not what he's saying. He's also not saying that, I had to write this down because I always get it wrong in how I say it. He's also not saying that God makes bad things good. He's saying that God brings good out of the bad. And that's such an important distinction for us to remember. And so I think that's really important as we sometimes take that verse out of context or use it in a way that is almost weaponizing. And so I think that's one thing. I think the other thing that's helpful to me is in the midst of the circumstances of life, often we don't understand. We're not, and while we want to, we very well may not understand what God is doing in this particular moment. And yet what's been helpful to me is to think about at the end of time, when I look at the sum total of my life, I'm going to see God's work of what he has done in my life to bring about his glory. I may not understand it in this moment, but there will be a time where I'll see it. And so because of that, in this moment, even in the midst of difficult circumstances, I can trust in the goodness and the sovereignty of God.
Yeah, I think so important, some of the things that you said there. One, just the whole idea of empty platitudes. I think sometimes we find ourselves, this is what I thought about in some sense with several items on this list. We find ourselves prone to this Christianese, right? These what can be empty platitudes, because we want to have something to say in a moment that we're not quite sure what to say.
Right.
And it sometimes can wind up actually then becoming about us rather than actually the person who's going through hard times. And so we have to just be, I think, mindful of the fact that sometimes just showing up for people who are going through hard stuff and not feeling like we have to have a solution, an answer, what can feel like an empty platitude, that may be more about us feeling better in that awkward moment than actually helping them feel better. But then, the other thing, that just that idea of like, we have to never call something good that God would call bad, right? So it's not God makes bad things good. It's God works all things together for good. God can bring good out of even bad things. And so it's looking for what is it that God brings out of this bad thing. But let's never take that bad thing and call it good. A divorce, abuse, a cancer, a death. Like, these are bad things, and we should always call them bad things, even as we're able to see the good that God brings out of it. I think about losing my sister, and I've told this story before. Like, my sister's best friend from childhood trusted Christ through the last days of my sister's life, because my sister Amy said to her, "I want to know that I'm going to see you in heaven." And they had this just beautiful, tender moment of connection. And like, God did something beautiful, brought good out of this bad thing, but the thing itself is still a bad thing. But then the other thing that I think is really important is Romans 8:28, always being careful about taking a verse all by itself and out of its context. Romans 8:28 is immediately followed by Romans 8:29, right? And Romans 8:29 says, "For," so he's continuing the thought, "For those whom God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son." So the whole thought together is, we know that God works all things together for good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. For those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. It's the recognition that the good that God works in our lives through all the circumstances that we face is the good of making us more like Jesus. And when we can actually adopt that kind of mentality, that's when we are able to now watch for how he's doing that in real time, right? In the midst of these circumstances, right? In the midst of this version of all things. God, what are you doing to bring about the good of making me more like Jesus? Yeah,
I love that, because when we think about that verse, if we just stopped at 8:28, we have all sorts of things that we want, that we think are good. But the goodest good that God says is to be formed in the image of his Son, right? That's really good. Love it.
All right. I would keep on, but I'm just going through the list here.
You got a bunch for us.
Everything happens for a reason.
Oh,
we've never heard that one before.
Oh my.
Yeah.
This one is, I think, really, really unfortunate because it can actually wind up torturing people who are going through incredible pain, right? Because what happens is, if we adopt this mentality, everything happens for a reason, then we find ourselves desperate to know what the reason is. As of some sense of, I'll be able to get through this, or I'll be able to accept this, I'll be able to endure this if I can just figure out God's reason for it. And the reality is that there are things in our lives, there are things in this world for which we will not know the reason this side of heaven. God hasn't promised to disclose his reason for allowing certain things to happen. This is the story of Job. Job is completely overwhelmed by the question, why? Right? And Job goes through unimaginable suffering. And then he's tortured by the question, why? Why would God allow this? And his friends come along and offer him all kinds of reasons why they think God must have let this happen. And it's by the end of the story, Job has this encounter with God, and he doesn't get the answer to the question why. There's never an answer to the question why in the book of Job, but Job encounters God in a way that enables him to trust him. And by the end, that's enough for Job, right? I can trust you. And so it's recognizing that if we find ourselves so caught up in the answer to the question, why did God allow this? And we can be tortured by trying to find what may remain elusive, rather than rather than the question, why did God allow this? It's what's God's purpose in this, right? What is the good that God may be working in my life or in the world, even in the midst of this bad thing? I mean, connecting it back to what we just talked about, that rather than tortured by what's God's reason for this, to be able to really try to wrestle with what's God's purpose in this? What is he trying to accomplish in and through this, even if I don't know why ultimately he's allowed this into my life?
Yeah, I think sometimes we take that, everything happens for a reason, and we're thinking about the sovereignty of God, that God's in control and everything happens for a reason. And so in that sense, I see why people might, say something like that. Where I think it's problematic is, what I love about the Bible is it doesn't have a saccharine view of life, right? Like every cloud doesn't have a silver lining. The Bible is so real about life. I think about Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. Jesus knows what he's about to do. He could have stood there and just thought to himself, you know what, in the next few moments, I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead, and this crowd is going to see the power of God. They're going to see the glory of God. They're going to trust in me. He could have stood there smiling. It's not what he does. He weeps at the tomb of Lazarus, that he laments with us. He mourns with us. He's with us in the midst of our sorrow and our pain. He doesn't just explain it away. And that's a God I can trust, and so I think, we have to be careful about, yes, we believe and trust in the sovereignty of God, but we may not know why. But we trust the character of God enough to say that's okay.
Yeah. Let's move to sin.
Let's do.
Here's one. Love the sinner. Hate the sin.
Yeah. I think you have some background on this.
Classic.
You got some history.
Well, I was going to do that with, I think, one that's a little later on the list, but love the sinner, hate the sin. There's something we should affirm. Like there's something there that's actually true and worthy of affirmation, right? That we know God loves all of us, sinners as we are. And so therefore we ought to extend that same kind of love and grace, towards others, while also recognizing God hates sin, and so should we. I think where we get ourselves in trouble is that we sometimes become more preoccupied with other people's sin than our own. Right?
Yeah.
And that's where we get off track, is that it's easy for me to look at the sinners out there and hate their sin. It's a lot harder for me to actually look at my own and hate my own sin. And so, especially when we come to the church, I'm always wanting to be careful as a pastor not to sort of shake my finger at the world, those people out there, but recognize, no, we need to deal with what's in here and in this room, and what's in here, that is in my heart. And, it's funny. I had a classic Barry and Kim Jones marital moment yesterday. I got home from work. I was at elders meeting, and we went long. So I got home. It was about 9:30 last night. And Kim was waiting for me, and she had not been able to go back into the laundry room where she was doing laundry because there was a dead roach on the floor in the laundry room. And it had been there. She discovered it hours earlier. It was dead. Whatever we, had for a exterminator, came out, like it was working, but it was still there, and she wasn't about to touch it. She wasn't about to pick it up and move it. And so the clothes are just sitting in there, and she's like, you're going to have to go in there and get that roach up. And it made me think of, I told a similar story about discovering a scorpion in our, in our bed sheets years ago. And so, the way I said it in the sermon was, God, I want to hate my sin as much as my wife hates roaches, or how much my wife hates scorpions. And it's a silly little story, but that's just a reminder of, like, my problem all too often is I love my sin, right? Or at least my sin isn't that big a deal.
Yeah.
And so I make a bigger deal out of somebody else's sin than my own. And I want to be the kind of follower of Jesus that is more preoccupied by hating my own sin than getting caught up in hating somebody else's.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think I would say a lot of what you said. We are called to love. We're called to love our neighbor, and we're called to love all people, regardless of whether they're believers or they think differently than us. And so that's true. We're called to reject sin. That's true as well. I think, again, the dangerous part of this is it can lead to us having this attitude that's almost dismissive of others, particularly when we're talking about really deep personal struggles. And so I think it could be really hurtful to people, and it can lead to self-righteousness, right? Where it's so much easier for me to focus on someone else's sin than to look at my own. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree.
Almost like a judgy.
Yeah. And that's not, Jesus, I think again about Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. He's the only one that has compassion on her, right? So he shows her love and compassion, but at the same time, he says, go and sin no more. We're not to hold, we rarely hold both love and truth in balance like that, the way Jesus does. And so I think that's just something to be aware of, because the harshest criticism Jesus had for people were the religious leaders, who he calls hypocrites for the way they were not looking at their own sin and pointing to the sin of others.
God helps those who help themselves.
This was the one that I was thinking about historically a little bit. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes people will say that as though it's like they're quoting the Bible when they say it. God helps those who help themselves, and it's nowhere in the Bible, right? In fact, I would say there's things that are very counter to that. Now, not to say that there's not a place for us to actually Paul says, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. But then he comes right back around and says, but it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. So there's some sense in which even your ability to work out your salvation
is from God,
right? It comes as gift. And that's where we have to always recognize the need for grace, rather than some sense in which we pull ourselves up our own bootstraps. So I think about the history of the Reformation and what was happening in the 16th century with Martin Luther, and Luther had lived this life as a monk, tortured by the reality of his own sin, and fearing judgment and damnation from God. So here's this monk, right, dedicated himself to a life of prayer in a monastery, but who lives in this perpetual sense of fear and dread before God. And part of that, the reason for that, is he had been trained in a theological tradition coming out of medieval Catholicism, particularly associated with a school of thought called Ockhamism, and one of its chief proponents is a guy named Gabriel Biel. And Biel, his kind of understanding of the gospel and the righteousness of God can kind of be boiled down to this idea that says, to those who do what is in them, God does not deny grace. Right? To those who do what is in them, God does not deny grace. So the grace of God comes, but it comes in response to us doing our part. And Luther, understands my part is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And if I fail to do that, then I'm going to fail to receive the grace of God, because he had been trained with this idea, to those who do what is in them, God does not deny grace. Well, what does that sound like? Sounds an awful lot like God helps those who help themselves. And so in some ways, the whole beginning point of the Reformation in the 16th century was Luther's coming to recognize that this way of understanding the righteousness of God, this way of understanding the nature of the gospel, is completely false. That grace comes to us as gift, and that we receive it merely by faith. There's nothing that we do to earn, deserve, merit, conjure up the grace of God. God's grace is alien righteousness that is given to us as gift.
The gospel would say God helps those who can't help themselves. Right? That all we need is need. The Beatitudes start with, blessed are the poor in spirit. That we start from a posture of dependence of, I can't, but God can. And so I think that's where we get it wrong, because especially in our individualistic culture, we tend to think like, I can pull myself up by my bootstraps. If I just white knuckle it, I can make it happen. And when we come to God, it's a complete dependence on, I can't, I don't have anything that I'm bringing to this. And so the posture of, we would love to think we add something to this, and yet the reality is we don't.
John 15, Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing.
This one we've hit in the past, but I think it's really important to hit again because we hear it so often. God never gives you more than you can handle.
Yeah, so I think we often hear this many of these we hear in these moments of, again, where you don't know what to say. So you're trying to come up with something to make it better. So in these moments where people are facing grief or suffering or some kind of pain, and typically it's in relation to 1 Corinthians 10:13. I'll just read that first. It says, no temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond what you can bear. But when you're tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So the intention is to encourage those who are facing temptation that we actually can say, God has given us the ability to say no to sin. But where it gets twisted is we often apply this from temptation to trials. Yes. And that is absolutely not true. And in fact, Paul goes on to say in 2 Corinthians 1:8-10, he talks about like the situation that he's in. And he says, we don't want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. And here's what he says. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. And here's what Paul says. But this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God, who raises the dead. He has delivered us from a deadly peril. He will deliver us again. On him we have set our hope that he will continue to deliver. And so God gives Paul more than he can handle. He says, it was far beyond our ability to endure. We despaired of life itself. We thought we were going to die, but then he says, and Paul says, this is why God did it, so we wouldn't rely on ourselves, but on God. And I think that's a good word for us, that God does give us more than we can handle, but he also gives us the grace to handle it.
I think when we internalize this message of God will never give you more than you can handle, then when we find ourselves in circumstances that feel like more than we can handle, then it's compounded by the fact that now I feel like I have failed. Right.
What did
I am suffering this trial, this whatever's going on that feels like more than I can handle, and I'm a failure in it because God wouldn't do that to me, but I feel like and so it compounds rather than alleviates, rather than recognizing what Paul does here where he just says very plainly, this is beyond our ability to do. I couldn't do this in my own strength and my power. And yet then I turn to the power of God and the strength that is supplied to endure something that is beyond my ability and my own strength and power. And so I think opening our hearts to that idea of, in the midst of those kinds of circumstances, it may genuinely, legitimately feel, it may genuinely, legitimately be more than you can handle. And to look for God to meet you in that place. That's what he promises. That he will meet you in it. Not that it's not more than you can handle.
And it gets back to the idea of, again, Romans 8:29, that God is using even this circumstance that feels unbearable to form us and shape us to be like Jesus.
All right. Let's banter it up. At the end of each episode, we have some fun. We have a fun topic, and we give some opinions, fantasy draft things.
I don't talk about the 16th century or the Second Great Awakening, and we stay away from all that.
Well, I mean, somehow you find a way, though. You know what I mean? Not in the banter.
Did you prep any of that?
No,
that
he
you
just
did
has it.
A little bit
it's
ago?
So annoying.
There's just like names you bring out that I'm like, how many names does he have in his head?
And then he'll remember a quote, like word for word. I can't remember what I said yesterday.
Some like tablet in ancient.
And then there's things that I ought to remember that are completely lost to me. Yes.
Okay,
true.
so today's banter topic is youth slang phrases.
Nice.
So I'm going to throw out I
have an unfair advantage here.
We have to. I was going to say, Pastor Barry's kind of like he's up for this.
I have a freshman high school daughter.
Okay.
And I'm going to.
So I'm going to throw out a word, and if you're listening and you're like, I have no clue what these are. Some of these I didn't know what they were either. So I'm like Googling, like, what is this?
Brain rot vocabulary.
So here we go.
Okay.
First word, rizz.
That's an easy one.
so
Come on.
much.
All right.
Look at this.
Now, Barry
Rizz.
can't be doing this. He can't be.
He's totally going to
He's like
do
looking
this.
at you. That's easy.
Come on.
Rizz.
Come on.
Rizz is
It's
like-
right there.
What
Rizz is just a shortened version of.
What is Rizz a short version
It's like-
of?
Hey, man, Barry's got some Rizz today.
Yeah, like flair.
Yeah, there you go.
Like, kinda
Okay,
like-
Or
yeah.
another word would be charisma.
Charisma?
Yeah.
Charisma.
Yeah.
Charisma. Rizz.
Charisma, style, charm.
There
He's
it
going to
is.
give us the Latin of.
There we go. Let's do etymology of
Yeah,
all the
He's totally gonna,
brain rot vocabulary.
All right, here's one. Sus.
Oh, that's suspect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know
Suspicious,
that.
yeah.
So should we just start with Sissy
Yeah.
each time
Yeah.
and then?
Sissy doesn't know,
Bears
so
the
she's
phone
guessing. He actually knows.
Okay, this one really got me at camp this past summer
Yeah.
because I had no clue.
So they
Yeah.
used it.
Yes,
Said
all
it in
over
a
the
sentence
place.
to you.
they said in a sentence, and I felt really old. Mewing.
Mewing. I have heard this.
Yeah. What do you
Mewing.
like thinking about?
No.
No. Hmm.
Yeah, I think it's a compliment,
Okay.
Oh.
but I don't remember exactly what it means.
It's like an act. So this kid asked me, he's like, "Hey, I'm gonna mew. Will you take a picture of me?" And I'm like, "Don't know what you're talking about."
Yeah. What are you
But-
about to do?
And it's
Yeah.
where you like do this thing with your jawline to where you clench your jawline and then you trace the jawline with your finger
Oh.
to like show
All right.
that you
I
have this
wouldn't have-
defined
I
jaw.
wouldn't have gotten that.
Never knew this, but then I started going on the Reddit rabbit hole of
There you
parents talking about mewing, and it was, yeah. All right, here's one. Cap.
I've heard a cap.
Or like someone
No
will say
cap.
like no
go. No
cap.
cap.
No cap. I've heard a no cap. I don't know what that means.
So it's
No
like,
lie.
yeah.
There you
yeah,
go.
There you go.
Let's
yeah.
go.
Yeah.
I'm not lying to you.
Yeah.
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 All right. Bussin.
That's like really good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yeah. You're not bad at this.
Did you know that one?
Yeah. Generally speaking.
Do you use that in your vocabulary?
Do you know, maybe with my 14-year-old to like really make her cringe.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
She doesn't like when Barry
That-
uses
yeah.
those.
that would be like 8, right? Is that on the list? Bussin.
See, now
is
he's like throwing ones
I know,
out.
now
so
he's
8 is like you did that really well.
He's
You're 8.
showing up.
But then from there it goes to, oh, what's 4 plus 4? Which is of course 8. So that's a way of like celebrating when somebody's done something really well. Wow, 4
Look
plus
at
4.
this.
4 plus 4.
All right. What about Sigma?
Yeah, I have no idea.
Yeah.
Sigma. You tell us.
So Sigma, there's a couple of different ways it's used. One is like for a person. And so it's like connected to this, like a person who's like an alpha.
Uh-huh.
And then you have a Sigma. So it's a good thing. But then it's also used with, and I think this connects back to a meme that I believe finds its origin from SpongeBob, which is what the Sigma. And so it's used as a,
Because
Yeah.
if it's origin, I mean, he's
Yeah.
all over it.
I know, but that's
tell
like
you where it is.
100% right. Like,
Squidward, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Look at that.
What the Sigma?
Yeah.
Yeah. This is what he's
That
doing in
gets,
his
that
office.
gets set around our house from
This
time to
is
time.
incredible.
What the Sigma?
All right. Mid.
Oh, that's like okay.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
those shoes
Yeah.
are mid.
Yeah.
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 All right.
Yeah, it's not.
Thirsty.
I don't want to describe this one.
Caroline's laughing. Thirsty is desperate for attention.
Okay.
We'll just put that one in there.
Yeah.
All right. 2 more. Slaps.
That's like so good.
Something's
That,
excellent,
yeah,
excellent
that
or
8,
amazing.
That 4 plus 4.
Well, let's go.
That slaps.
Yeah, that slaps.
hmm
That cheeseburger slapped.
Yep.
Yeah.
I use it mostly in connection with food. That's
With
where
food.
I've heard it. Yeah.
Yeah. Last one. Wait, you said you used that.
I haven't used it. I've heard it.
Oh, okay. I was like,
Can I guess what the last
I
one
have
is?
never
Because
used
if
it.
it's not the last one, it should be. Because have we talked about yet? Skibbity. I mean,
Skibbity.
come on.
all right,
That is-
skibbity.
Tell us about
Skibbity.
Skibbity.
So skibbity is like not a good thing. And so then you can combine these. So Ohio, we haven't talked about Ohio
Yeah.
either. Ohio is something that's like just like lame,
Yeah.
right? And so
Sorry.
So,
from Ohio.
if you have Skibbity Ohio Rizz, right?
Yeah.
You can have
Oh.
Sigma Rizz.
Like this behind me right now.
leaf
Ohio.
blower.
Ohio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ohio leaf blower right here behind me.
You can have
Skibbity.
you can have Sigma Rizz, but then you can have like Skibbity Ohio Rizz. Like you got no Rizz.
Oh.
Does Kathleen say this like in the house? Like,
No, he's practicing. He's like he says it. Kathleen's not saying it.
all right, I
It's
did
Barry.
want to ask about chuggy.
Chuggy.
This was a new one.
I've never.
I know I've heard chuggy. I can't come up with what it means.
Outdated, trying too hard to be trendy.
Chuggy.
Chuggy.
Chuggy kind of fits the word too. Like that's chuggy.
Chuggy.
You're being chuggy.
Yeah,
Right?
I got to use it 3 times and then I'll know it. So if you see me today, I might use it.
Sissy, I'm shocked. You like really undersold yourself going into this.
Well, I know what's going on.
You knew a lot. I mean, Barry was talking about
Barry's like
origin.
Yeah, well, actually, this came from.
We haven't even talked about Skibidi.
Yeah.
Like,
guys, this is not.
So, when Barry uses one of these words in a sermon,
I'm being very chuggy.
You know exactly what these are for. All right, here we are. Thank you for another week.
The leaf blower episode.
Yeah, at the very end. Ohio. We'll be back next week for another week informed.